I think it really all happened through the family environment, and I'm a farmer's daughter. I was brought up on a farm, but yet our social time and when we had relatives round was usually about singing traditional Scottish songs or reciting poetry or telling stories, that kind of thing. And of course this was in the days before computers and social media. So, and I went to a tiny country primary school that only had 2 teachers and about 43 pupils, I think at one point it got. So every Friday we would all be given a general music lesson. And that really was important because, you know, along with music and art and dance and all sorts of things, that was just a regular thing we had on a weekly basis. So by the time I left primary school, I could read music. And so that sort of interest continued during my secondary school days, and there was a very good music department at the secondary school I went to, Ellen Academy. We had a school orchestra, a school band, choirs, recorder groups, pop groups, you name it, it was there. So there was a high percentage of the school that played music. So I think the combination of the family environment and the school education really worked well together, and that fueled my interest. Well, I began losing my hearing from the age of 8, and by the time I was 12 I was dependent on hearing aids. Right. And again, it was really through a yearly audiological test that we had, that again the whole primary school had within one day, that it was sort of picked up on. And I was also noticing things that I was slightly sort of getting confused in group environments, that I was finding I was really concentrating on people and conversation. I was falling slightly behind with the homework and so on. So this was just enough also for the teachers to alert my family. And again, this whole communication between what was happening at school and that family unit was very important. And so then obviously I had tests and that was that. But I had actually started piano at the age of 8, so I was already playing music. And when you're that age, anything is possible. You don't feel I'm going deaf, you know, you feel something is changing, but you don't quite know what it is. And it's usually other people who put the kind of no-nos and no, you can't do this and so on, and you know, it's a catastrophe. But at that age, you're so elastic, you're so adaptable, and that's really what happened to me. So things like lip reading was happening without really my knowing it was happening. So everything was really quite organic. I mean, really, I would say from about the age of 12, 13, I thought that sound came through the ears. And so when I was playing, and I started percussion from the age of 12, and when I was playing percussion, I found that inside of myself, I felt quite sensitive as a musician. You know, I knew about dynamics, I knew about the sense of touch to create different sound colours, you know, maybe a heavy colour or a lighter colour or a more aggressive feel or a more loving feel and so on. So I understood about that, but that wasn't what I was perceiving. I was just perceiving a noise, and because all of the sound was being boosted by the hearing aids, so I couldn't actually differentiate the texture or the pitches and things like that. So, and I found that my sense of touch was all about just dynamics, getting it louder and louder, and that I knew wasn't really me as a player. And my teacher at the time, he said, well, Evelyn, you know, this drum, as he struck a drum, really resonates there. If that drum resonates, do we resonate? You know, can we actually pick up the resonance of that drum and allow it to be fed through the body rather than the sound being fed through the ear? So I took my hearing aids off, and I actually heard less through here, but more through the body, and that really allowed me to concentrate on the whole journey of that sound, the impact of the sound, the resonance of the sound, and taking care of how that sound ended. That was really important, whereas before I was just sort of bang, 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 things like that. So that was a completely new dimension for me of being a musician, of listening, to understanding about sound, to appreciating sound, and perhaps more importantly to controlling that sound so that I could then be the musician I wanted to be. Well, I auditioned for two places because I was still quite young, the Royal College of Music and the Royal Academy of Music. And the Royal Academy of Music was sort of quite sceptical. They just said there's no orchestra in this country or anywhere would employ a hearing impaired musician. And I said, well, I don't want to be in an orchestra. I want to be a soloist. I want to be a solo percussionist. So that in itself was yet another sort of, whoa, you know, there's absolutely no visualization of that in their minds at all, because the majority of people who left these institutions went into orchestras. Of course, it's different nowadays. And so that was the first thing, but also they just had this barrier of a deaf musician, and therefore they could not accept a deaf musician. And I felt that, well, if you're saying I'm of the standard to get into this institution, then I have to be let in, you know, no matter what someone's circumstances are. If they're of that standard, they must get in. It's as simple as that. And so they asked me to do another totally unprepared audition. So I had to travel all the way down again from Scotland to do this unprepared audition, which required no percussion playing at all, but was all about keyboard playing, transposition, reading from full scores, figure bass, all of these sort of musical things that we do. And they said on the spot, right, we'll accept you. So basically it took 2 goes for this to happen, but perhaps more importantly, it allowed them to change their thinking. So it really made them realize that yes, they have to accept people no matter what their circumstances. So if someone walks in there with no arms, no legs, or, you know, no head or whatever, it doesn't matter. If they are of that standard, they get in. It's hard to say because piano has always been important to me, but with percussion I just felt that I had such a variety of instruments, you know, to experiment with. You're dealing with all different kinds of frequencies as well, from very high to very low, lots of dynamic ranges, much more so than most other instruments. And then obviously over the years the collection of instruments has grown, and it's such a global family of instruments. It's also a really adaptable family in that, you know, if someone is in a wheelchair or has limited movement or has so many other different types of challenges, there's always a percussion instrument there that can be adapted and approachable. So that sort of sharing experience is incredible. And I think that with percussion, you know, it brings people together. So I've often found that the spoken word can be a barrier, but actually as soon as you strike something, that sort of rhythm, that beat, that resonance, it makes that connection. So, and I've really found that over the years. And I found that there was no such thing as a full-time solo percussionist. Now, I thought it did exist because a lot of my school colleagues and myself played solo percussion in the school concerts and things like that. And it was only when I became a full-time student in London that, you know, it was sort of drawn to my attention that such a thing as a full-time solo percussionist did not actually exist. So I was sort of paving the way for that, and that made me really determined to be a solo percussionist. And of course with that, it isn't just about playing your instruments, it's about how do you function as a solo percussionist, you know, how do you move your gear, how do you negotiate the pieces that you're going to play depending on how much instruments you're going to use, you know, how are you going to finance all of this and then convince promoters to put on a percussion concert as opposed to a piano recital or a violin recital when they don't have to even think about the percussion instruments. So there's lots of things that had to be, you know, put into play, not to mention commissioning pieces of music to play. So it's been a fascinating journey and one I wouldn't have missed at all. Well, I think it's something that's been ticked Yes, it has, in that, and when I say that, it's only been ticked knowing that there's plenty people from the younger generations coming through and doing this. So they're really participating in the commissioning of the pieces, of giving these solo performances and so on, and pushing the boundaries as regards to what a solo percussionist is. So physically what you can do, mentally what you can do as well, and that's really important. I would not have ticked that box if I was still the only one. So it's been really important to have people come through and say to themselves and believe that yes, I also want to be a solo percussionist. So that's important. So now that gives me, although I'm still obviously heavily involved in that arena, it's also giving me the choice and time to do other things, and that's really important. So that's been one of the things that I've wanted to do and continue to do. But you know, physically, just through the natural state, the body is not going to play percussion forever, just as, you know, Usain Bolt had to give up running 100 meters because he knew he listened to the body, you know. And that's going to happen with me too. But that doesn't stop me from being a musician. And the world of music is so huge and varied. And so I'm doing lots of other different types of things within that umbrella of music. And that's important to keep pushing the boundaries. I think a bit of both, really. I mean, when you are carving out a career as a musician, it's a tough old business actually, and you have to be very thick-skinned. It's not all about the glamour that you think it is. You've just got to have a lot of determination, that ability to work, that ability to absorb the negatives and pick yourself up from that, and really, you know that from those negatives there really are positives, but you go through the pain of the negatives, and you've got to ride with that and allow that pain to come through, you know, that mental pain. And and I think for me, a lot of the inspiration I get is from all people that I meet, you know, regardless of their situation. And, you know, I've met some incredible players or incredibly inspirational people who have absolutely nothing, you know, who really have nothing. And we say they may have nothing, maybe very little money or very meagre housing or whatever it may be, but what they have inside of themselves and what they're willing to give is absolutely priceless, you know. And often that thing is time and wanting to listen, really. It's wanting to be in the presence of someone. And that's quite a valuable thing. And I've really, I suppose, felt that through the work I do with young people, where it's quite easy to sort of almost fit them into a system or a method or something like that. Totally the wrong direction. Each person is, you know, a special seed, as it were, and how they're treated has to be completely individualized, and that makes then the journey for both of us really special. So I think that, you know, as far as you know, I suppose identifying people who may be blind or deaf or whatever other situation, yes, of course there are musicians out there, you know, who are doing amazing work and they're incredibly inspirational. But likewise, you know, you see each person with all sorts of challenges, whether they're visible or not, you know, and it's important that we all just take the time to connect and see the value in each person. For all young people, I feel you have the opportunity to connect with all people, regardless of their situation. So, and what I'm finding actually at the moment is that I'm working quite a bit with people who have dementia. And we imagine, well, that's something that relates to older people, you know, and we focus on that. But actually, dementia can happen when you're really, really young. And the power of the presence of young people connecting with the older generation is so, it's so amazing. It's a form of medicine in a way, and I think for all young people we can see ourselves as a form of medicine to someone else. Well, for all young people who have a mental or physical disability, my message is value yourself, you know, really value and love yourself, really know that you have a place in this world and that is valued, and really believe in the strengths that you have. And all people, no matter what their circumstances, has this journey, life's journeys with ups and downs, peaks and troughs. We all have that. But really that underlying thing of believing in yourself, work hard, we all have to work hard, and that's that, but just believe. Well, it's interesting in that I suppose the message I have for any hearing impaired person who wants to be involved in music is absolutely go for it. It belongs to you too. And I remember as a pupil at my school up in Scotland, it had this ethos whereby every child has a story and every child belongs to all departments of the school. Now that's quite powerful. So for a young hearing impaired person myself at that time, I was completely welcomed into the music department. So that's important. And that has to be, you know, and you know, just the other day I happened to be working with an orchestra in Mexico, and the conductor of that orchestra actually was hearing impaired. He was a brilliant conductor. You know, really interesting. And I think, you know, that's just one example of a professional musician going around the world conducting many different types of orchestras, and we're not focusing on his hearing impairment, we're focusing on the fact that he's a great conductor. You know, I'm a percussion player, I'm a musician, that's what I am. So, and I think that if you can really build on the strengths that you have and make those as your identity, that's important. Well, I think what was interesting there, and my message was about valuing each person and listening to each person. That, you know, even if we're in disagreement or, you know, there's debate or conflict or whatever it might be, we've got to take that time to listen, and that means taking the time to digest. So rather than being reactive all the time, immediately on something that's said, we have to almost like food, digest that food, digest those words, just take a little moment really to try and reflect what it is that the person is saying, how it's being said, and how we then put our message across. And when there is that healthy kind of communication, even if we're poles apart from agreeing with each other or whatever the situation is, there still has to be that time. And I almost relate it to perhaps pieces of music, whereby I might look at a piece of music or try a piece of music, and it's very easy for musicians like myself to say, oh, I don't like that piece, and then you don't try, you sort of always don't like that piece. It's so important for me to say, okay, I'm not sure if I fully get this piece at this time, however, I'm going to give this a go, see what happens, and 9 times out of 10 you will end up really liking that piece of music, and you will end up playing that piece of music many times, and it's just because your mindset is changing. So, and I think that if there is a transparent message happening and that will to make action, that will to make change for the better, and learning from our global colleagues, that's so crucial. Music is definitely a global means to connect with each other, and within music, within that language, there are lots of dialects really. So if I think about Indian music, I don't see that as a different language, I see it as a different dialect and something that takes time. Or Indonesian music or Latin American music, and within Latin American music you've got many different dialects going on there. So, or Scottish music even. And that's what's interesting about being a musician, is that you know you can't just spend an hour working on African music and say I'm an expert in African music. Of course I'm not, you know. And that's the kind of integrity that we have within the music world. You know, we know that you can find, you know, a specialist in the traditional instrument in Korea called the chango, you know, and find great chango players or great vibraphone players or great timpanists or great snare drummers, you know. So I can look at all of these instruments and know that there's a specialist on all of these instruments, or each individual instrument within the collection, you know. So that's quite humbling, you know, and it keeps my feet on the ground. I think it's changed over time, I suppose, but at the moment I'm really drawn towards Beethoven, and I'm not choosing Beethoven just because of the similarities of losing your hearing, but I just feel that the more I delve into his music, and of course he didn't write for solo percussion, so I'm looking at this from a musician's perspective, I just see an amazing journey there, that he has manipulated sound and, more importantly, manipulated silence and the weight of silence, and that's something we don't really recognize today in the busy world that we live in. And that's been interesting to sort of see how he's kept sort of redefining himself as a composer through what he's composed, and it gives me inspiration to just sort of keep peeping around the next corner, or turning the next page, or peeling the next layer off and seeing what if, you know, what if, and even if it's, well, I don't get it or something, it doesn't matter. You just keep being curious, and that for me is important. Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question, and I think that a lot more can be delved into that, because we have so little to draw upon, even from reading books. We're just sort of assuming things all of the time. And we know that he didn't have the technology, we know he didn't have fancy hearing aids, and we knew that he had to just go with his gut reaction, and he knew that sound was about vibration, and hence why he put, you know, his mouth on the keyboard and kind of bit that keyboard in order to feel the vibration. We knew that certain things became much more thick in his orchestration, probably in order for him to feel much more. We knew that the rhythm became much more strict because he needed to feel that beat in his body. So there's all sorts of tiny little subtle things that changed, I think, according to how he was hearing and how he was relating to his own compositions. And I don't know, I just find that really fascinating, and I just often think about how would Beethoven be if he just appeared in 2018, you know, how, you know, if you laid out the technology in front of him, how would he react? And I just get the feeling that he would have been, wow, this is incredible, I want to experiment with this. I just get the feeling that he was a man of experimentation. No, I don't take that view only through my own situation. If my situation was different, I may perhaps feel the same as the majority of other people. And no one can know that for sure. You know, of course we don't. We're just assuming. We don't have YouTube videos of Beethoven playing and or recorded material even. So I can only relate that to my own situation and how important it is to really connect with the sound through the whole body. So I can understand why Beethoven clutched the keyboard with his teeth and really felt the vibration literally through his teeth, through his cheekbones and scalp and, you know, upper face and so on, his neck. I get that, you know, I really do. So, and I think that if we didn't have the technology ourselves, I'm sure we would be adapting our bodies in very different ways, you know. So that's evolution though, and that's a good thing. I think things are changing. I mean, when you look at the big picture, they are changing. There are sort of certain things that are every day are frustrating, you know. It could be, you know, in my case, it could be someone saying, "Oh, just give me a call on the phone." You know, well, no, that's not going to happen. I'll certainly text you or Skype you or something like that, but just to call up, that isn't going to happen. So, or you know, services in shops or whatever, where even if you tell someone that, well, you've just got to face me when you speak, they'll still go off and you know what I mean, and look away and whatever. But that's a habit thing, and it's also a training thing, you know, and a lot can be done through training and through education as well, understanding what our senses are about, you know, and really coming across people with various different types of challenges and talking to people at schools, you know, getting, I mean, I find that if I invite people to my rehearsals, you know, in the concert halls, it's amazing the difference between sitting in the auditorium and actually being on stage, and how much they perceive on stage as opposed to being in row 20 out there in the concert hall, where they'll actually perceive much less, you know, or the feeling of looking out into the audience as opposed to looking onto the stage. So there's a lot of psychological things that go on in actually it sort of changes how much we hear, strangely, you know, but it just does. So I think that there's all sorts of things, but most of all, it's communication. We need to communicate with each other to know how we need to function, what are the tools we need, but most importantly, valuing each person and knowing that there is a place for each person to make a difference.